Hey everyone, Mr. Wineland here with Chapter 10, Section 2. Let me adjust my camera. Boo-boo. We're going to go over, this is part 1. We're going to go over as part of the Spanish-American War. We're going to break this up into 2 parts. What we need to know about the Spanish-American War is that really a lot of this comes down to Cuba. Really right around the time of in the late 90s, you had a lot of dispute and problems going on in Cuba with Spain, and being reported by many people around that area. One of them was in 1896. James Creelman traveled to Cuba as a New York World reporter covering the Second Cuban War for the independence of Spain, because during this time, as we're going to learn in this section, Cuba is trying to win its independence. In Havana, he wrote columns about his observations of the war and many descriptions about the atrocities that were happening, which ultimately brought sympathy to a lot of Americans for the Cubans. And so we're going to see in this, people like Creelman in the newspapers are going to help build up American sentiment towards the Cubans and eventually bring us to war with Spain. What we see happening is that in the end of the 19th century, Spain, once the most powerful colonial nation on earth, lost a lot of its colonies. They were slowly losing. You have to remember that, you know, if you took world history, the age of exploration, you see Spain had not only taken up but much of North America, which had control of Florida as one of its colonies. They had Mexico. They had much of the West. They also had parts of Asia. But during the late 1800s, right around the end of the 19th century, they had lost most of those, and a lot of that they lost all of the west of the United States, what we now call the United States. They lost that to Mexico. Early in the 1800s, they did sold Florida to us. There was other parts of Latin America that they lost some of their colonies, and they were on the verge of potentially losing some of their other colonies. But they were able to hold on to the Philippines, Guam, and the Pacific, and some outposts in Africa, Caribbean islands of Cuba, Puerto Rico. But Spain, a lot of this was due upon themselves. Economically, they were struggling, and there's certain aspects as well as within their government, but they were losing, and that was not good. But United States had some interest in Cuba. We bought Florida from them before, and Cuba's only like 90 miles south of Florida. And so in 1854, diplomats actually, under President Franklin Pierce, actually wanted to buy Cuba from Spain. So they responded saying, but the Spanish would respond saying that we'd rather see Cuba sink in the ocean. We don't want to sell it to you. So Cubans did rebel against Spain in 1868 to 1878, did build up some American sympathy, and there was a revolt against them. But the revolt was not successful. But in 1886, the Cuban people were able to force Spain to abolish slavery. And then after emancipation of the Cuban slaves, we see that American capitalists jumped on this, investing millions of dollars in large sugarcane plants in the islands, gaining some of that opportunity. Now, even though the Cubans were unsuccessful in their ability to win independence in their first revolt, they would eventually continue to build more and more sympathy. And people like Jose Marti, a Cuban poet and journalist in the exile in New York, launches his second revolution in 1895. Marti organized Cuban resistance against Spain using an active guerrilla campaign and deliberately destroying property, especially American-owned sugar mills and plantations, which that kind of bothered a little bit in the United States. But eventually Marti was able to provoke United States intervention to help the rebels achieve Cuba Libre, which is free Cuba. U.S. public opinion would split, though. You had businesses who were going, we support Spain because obviously they're making money with their situation. Others did favor the Cuban cause, and the cry for Cuba Libre, after all, was becoming a big sentiment, kind of like Patrick Henry's "Give me liberty or give me death." So what we would see is that ultimately by 1896, you're seeing Spain responded the Cuban revolt by sending General Varino Weyler to Cuba to restore order. However, he was kind of a jerk and really kind of brutal. Weyler tried to crush the rebellion by herding entire rural population of the central and western Cuba using barbed wire and actually putting them in concentration camps. So pretty brutal. Some genocide going on there. Civilians couldn't even get aid to the rebels. Estimated that 300,000 Cubans filled in these camps, where thousands died from hunger and disease. Very brutal. Um, Very brutal methods. So newspapers are getting word of what's going on, and so you see that American newspaper tycoons like William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer are exploiting Weyler's actions in the circulation war. So basically, timing works out for Cuba in this situation because we talked about this in the late 1800s. Pulitzer and Hearst are both building their own newspaper empires. And so when they get news of this going on in Cuba, it's like, how can we sell papers? I have an idea. Let's talk about this guy hurting people and locking them up, and people are dying because of hunger and disease. We're going to get people to buy papers and read this and go, I want to hear more of what's going on because I'm mad at this. So, in some ways, yes, they were informing the public, but they're also taking advantage of the situation, going, here's a guy, we got a villain. This villain's going to help us sell papers. So they definitely jump on what's going on in Cuba. So they lure readers in with the New York Journal and the New York World, and we see these accounts from reporters talking about poisoned wells and children being thrown to the sharks, deepened American sympathy for these rebels. So some of these stories may have been exaggerated or flat out lies, but it worked. It got people to buy papers, and people were like, this isn't right. Something needs to be done. But this type of writing became a new form of writing known as yellow journalism, where sensational writing used to lure or engage readers. Basically, disingenuine writing. It's not good, solid journalism. Journalism is to get down and know the truth, be honest with the people, not delegitimize what's going on. But unfortunately, at this time, that the honor is out. There's no honor, and it's all about business, and that's ultimately what's happening. So ultimately, this is going to cause some call for war. So headlines like "Cuba Libre" increased American sympathy for the independence of Cuba. We see President William McKinley took office in 1897, and he comes in. He's like, "Look, I don't want war. I just can't get in the office. Do I really want to jump into war? That's a bad idea. Don't want to deal with that crisis." So at first, he's kind of working with Spain, going, "Hey, can you get this guy out of here, this General Weyler out of here?" And they modified the policies, and they do recall the general, and they kind of modify the concentration camps. Like, well, okay, we're just gonna kind of make sure that we don't kill anybody. So and offered Cuba limited self-government. So kind of put some things there. However, in February of 1898, the New York Journal published a private letter written by Enrique Dupe de Limon, the Spanish minister. Apparently, he wrote a letter which was not supposed to be seen by the United States, but somehow it got leaked. And McKinley saw this and it called him weak and a coward. And so this ultimately starts to sway the public and really gets McKinley to go, hey, that's not nice. And so ultimately the embarrassed Spanish government apologized, minister resigned, but still damage is done. Americans are angry, and there's just, it's ultimately leading to possible war. So things start to escalate with the United States as fever escalates. The U.S. Marine explodes in this war that would ultimately lead to war. So we see it a few days after the publication of that letter, and there's outrage towards Spain, even though Spain tried to apologize and say, hey, we're sorry. We see in 1898, President McKinley ordered USS Maine to Cuba to bring home American citizens in danger from fighting to protect American property. By February 15th of 1898, the ship blew up in the harbor of Havana, killing over 260 men were killed. They didn't know why the ship exploded. However, American newspapers claimed that the Spanish had blown up the ship, and then things got worse when Hearst basically came out and said, offered a reward of $50,000 for capture of the Spaniards who supposedly committed the outrage. So this ultimately just heats things up. And by the way, your definition is in blue for USS Maine. If you need to pause, write it right here, and then also you want to add this as well. There was no holding back ultimately at this point. I mean, because of that one letter about McKinley, everybody was mad. They're frustrated. Then again, there was another cry, but this time in America, not from Cuba, and it was "Remember the Maine," basically a rallying cry, an intervention for Cuba. So it made no difference at this point for the Spanish government what they agreed on April 9th. To almost everything in the United States, as far as coming up with including a 6-month ceasefire. We see that even though Spanish had some concessions, and we're like, "We're sorry, we didn't mean to blow up the USS Maine." Public opinion was favoring towards war, and on April 11th, McKinley asked Congress for the authority to use forces against Spain. And then after a week of debate, Congress on April 20th of the United States declared war, which is a part of your definition for USS Maine. That's why I have it there. So that's so we go to war, and that is part 1 of section 2 here. We'll do part 2 in the next video as we'll go over the actual war itself. So see you then in the next video, guys.